Thanks for coming, you guys. It's 12:15. I'm going to start. Can you guys, I suppose everyone in this room can probably hear. Can people on GVC hear? I'm using a lapel mic. I just want to make sure it's functioning. Yeah, thumbs up.
Yep, loud and clear.
Awesome, thanks. So thanks for joining today. Let's see. So a year ago, a little more than a year ago, I was on the Daydream team working on Cardboard. I joined Google in 2011, joining Google X to start on a secret project that was a wingman and turned into glass, and then spent 4 years making the Explorer edition and then the Enterprise edition of that project, and then came over to Daydream a few years ago in 2015 and spent a couple years there working on Daydream View. And about a year and a half ago, was sort of thinking about what's next and talking to a friend, and he said, well, what's important to you? And I said, well, what's really important to me is my children. And actually, I'm starting to miss them more. They're starting to get more interested in their friends than their parents. And I was starting to feel like my time was almost up to teach them something interesting. And my wife, Rachel, and I, this is Rachel, by the way, had been talking for a long time about trying to spend a year abroad and just never kind of figured it out through work. And so she was walking past the living room one day. I was talking to a friend. I said, hey, what if we travel for a year? And in maybe the worst case of judgment in her entire life, she said, sure. So we started looking into this and figuring out if we could do it. And it turns out if you want to travel for a year as a Googler, it comes down to 5 easy steps. First, you have to convince your family. Then you have to convince the school. Then you have to quit your job. Google doesn't actually support sabbaticals. It was explained to me I could resign anytime I wanted. Rent your house, sell your car, and hope for the best. And so this was, pretty scary, felt risky at the time. We're like, well, what if the economy tanks? I don't know. This could be really the worst decision we ever made. So it was a little intimidating getting into it. But we talked to a bunch of families who'd done it before, and everybody said the same thing. They said, whatever you do, just do it. Best thing I've ever done. And so we had some goals. Our goals were mostly to show our kids different ways to live in the world. And in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of kids who are super stressed out because of all the pressure and because they think that the Silicon Valley norms are the norms of the world. That's the only way to be successful. And so a lot of kids it gets in their head. And we thought, it'd be good to show our kids some of the world so they can see that not everybody lives like this and there's lots of different ways to live. And so everywhere we went, we went to all these different countries that are really different from here. And we sent our kids to school everywhere. We went into people's homes. We learned how to cook from them. We learned how to shop from them. And we talked to them about life. And Rachel told me I had to be their teacher over the course of the year. And I've taught college, but never middle school. So I'm like, oh, what am I going to do? So it's like, okay, the school told me to do math. And then I thought, all right, everybody needs a project. And we'll just write about our topic every year. And so my topic was technology, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And my girl's topics, my younger daughter, who was 10, chose animals. We didn't know she loved animals so much before this trip. And then the older one chose children and children's wellness. And we all wrote books. This is my older daughter's book, so I'll kind of send that around afterwards if people want to see it. So my research was really like a lot of conversations with people about technology use. And I'll give a caveat. This is a quote from an ethnographer that I knew a long time ago, who said 1 story is an anecdote and 2 stories are data. And so this is data, but in a very superficial sense. I talked to a lot of people really broadly, but none of them for very long. So probably there's people in this room or in other rooms who have a lot more expertise on these topics than I do. And so these are meant to be conveyed as my observations, not the truth. And so hopefully these are like conversation starters. I'm just gonna try to report the things that I learned from people and the patterns that I saw. And so hopefully these are helpful for others. Really quickly, what's it like to travel for a year with a family of 4 at a rapid pace? Briefly in numbers, we had 1 rolly bag each. We went to 6 continents, all the ones with people on them. 25 countries, mostly what people used to call developing countries. We took 52 different forms of transportation. I'd say the one that got us most distance will come up, but 62 beds. This was in a monastery in Bhutan that took us in for the night. 75 flights. That's like a lot of flights. We spent 207 hours in the air. We had about 180 home-cooked meals, often in other people's homes. Way too many restaurant meals. This was a nice story, actually. This was we were in Amsterdam taking a break, and Rachel found that a Michelin star chef had recently gotten tired of the haute cuisine life and started a food truck in the middle of town. So we went to his food truck, and Paloma started chatting him up and got invited into the kitchen. And here she's getting a lesson on how to make falafel from him. So that was fun. And we had way too many water bottles. Even here where we're at an oasis in the middle of Sinai Peninsula, we couldn't drink the water because for the most part, it would make us sick. So we had lots and lots of bottled water. We felt kind of bad about the carbon footprint. We planted 35 trees in South America to apologize for it. All in all, we traveled 303 days. We wrote 3 books. And yeah, that's it for the statistics. So what tech did we bring with us to do our work? We each had a laptop. Actually, we had 3 laptops between the 4 of us. We had phones, we had noise canceling headsets, and we had lots of offline content. Our office and classroom was sort of anywhere we stopped for more than an hour and didn't need to sleep. And so I think this is in the Beijing airport. We had a 4-hour layover, so we got some work done. Offline tools and content were essential. I was actually writing a blog post at one point about this topic, and it took me a month to post the blog post because I didn't have connectivity for a month that was reliable enough to do a blog post. So it's just to give a sense of like the kinds of places we were, many places without internet service. Many of the things we saw over the course of the year were familiar. So we saw wearable computing. This Jordanian woman has tucked her cell phone into her headscarf, if you can't tell what's going on. We saw this guy driving down the freeway on a moped in Vietnam. I'm not sure if he's talking on the phone or taking my picture. We saw a little bit of VR in Jerusalem. Somebody's selling virtual tours of the old city. And I found VR in 2 other places. One of them was surprisingly this private school in rural Turkey, where these kids actually get a cardboard type VR headset with locally produced educational content to take home to get them more interested in their school. But I'd say in general, we saw no VR all year. I had to look really hard and I found it in 3 places. These 2 and then a telecom store in Sydney, Australia. So not getting out there too much yet, but and then we met some people who have great confidence in our tools. We had a guide in Istanbul who was explaining out to us that there's 2 kinds of people in the world. There's good people who are Muslims, and then there's everybody else. And it's like, well, what about atheists? He said, no, there's only 2 kinds of people. There's good people, and obviously you're good people, so you must be Muslim. And then there's everybody else. And he's like trying to give me an analogy, and he said, so it's very simple. Like when you're using Google Maps, do you listen to it? You do, because it's right. It's like, actually, I don't trust Google Maps because there's no like no such thing as right and wrong. And there's like everything's a spectrum. But he had this very simple idea that the content that we produce is in fact the truth, which I thought was like, it's different. Many things were very different though. So I'll start with some stories from Africa. We started out in Egypt, which I expected to be kind of very tech forward because I associate it with the Arab Spring and kind of, how Facebook was instrumental in free speech there. And it was really surprising to see how it is today. I'd say it's the country where I was most uncomfortable and felt most afraid all year. It's basically turned into a military dictatorship there. And it was the country in which people were least comfortable talking about politics. And we had 2 people tell us independently, kind of behind closed doors, like, I just think Egypt's not ready for democracy. And these were in like totally different parts of the country, even like totally different types of people. And it's like, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, about 25% of our people are illiterate. And the rest of the people haven't really ever been educated in what it means to be democratic, what it means to vote, how you think about a government, how a government can support the people. We just don't know that. And that's why when people voted for the first time, they voted in these militant Islamists who were trying to seize power originally. And the reason that we have our military in charge now is because the reaction to that was mass protests and it was about to be another revolution. And so the military stepped in to quell the revolution and they're still in control. And so we were hearing this in different ways from people. And so it was really like sort of surprising and a little disheartening to hear about this kind of backlash to the sort of freedom of speech that I think of when I think of the internet. from Egypt, we went down to South Africa, which was also one of the areas that was very, very hard for me. I think that gender inequality has really been at the top of our minds lately with the news at Google over the past couple of weeks. And it was very present for us when we were in South Africa, because the situation there for women is very bad. And it came out in different ways. Like in Johannesburg, someone was explaining to me that, I said, how do people have phones here? And he says, oh, many people have more than one phone. It's like, well, why? It's, because they have mistresses. They have one phone for each mistress. And it's like, huh. Okay, I've heard of dual SIMs being used that way in China, but I guess people take it another level here, really keep things separated. And it was explained to me later that it goes deeper than that. A guide who grew up in the slums there was taking us to one of the shanty towns and explaining to our kids, really. He said, the children here, they have no hope. And we said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they wake up early. They have to go fetch water and food. They have to cook breakfast for their brothers. And by the time they're about 13 or 14, they don't see any opportunities, because unemployment for young women in Johannesburg is 60%. And it's about 50% for young men. So there's no jobs. And so many of them are turning to these online dating sites like Blesser Finder, which are basically where like 40-year-old men go to pick up teen girls to have them as their girlfriends for a few years until they get pregnant, usually. And then they get rid of them. And the girls see no opportunities. They maybe want an iPhone. They maybe want a nice dress. They maybe want to feel like they're appreciated, like they have a hope outside the shanty town. And so there's this cycle that is really not leading to anything better for these women, except for maybe a very short period of time where they feel appreciated. And so it's really sad to hear about how like these tools that are used in one way here are taking on a different form there. We got into it more with the guides. Everyone we talked to who had daughters, we said, do you have daughters? What do you think? And they said, we worry for our daughters. About 1 in 4 people here has AIDS, and the incidence of sexual assault is like 40%. Like 40% of girls get raped or assaulted in South Africa. So it's the highest incident of sexual assault and rape in the world, both in the same place. So the fathers and the uncles are very worried for the young women. So it was really quite disturbing for me personally, as a father of 2 girls, to think about how the situation is really quite hopeless. I think, it being like 25 years after apartheid, I hope that things have gotten better, but there's still really a lot of challenges there. There's a lot of people in East Africa that are poor, and there's different kinds of poor. One reason people live in shanty towns is because they choose to. So we were flying over the shanty town outside Nigeria, right outside Nairobi. And there's about 300,000 people who live there. Most of them choose to live there because the rent is cheap. And so they have jobs in the city. They pay about $50 a month for a shack in the shanty town. They probably have a satellite dish on their roof for television. They pay about $20 a month for satellite TV. They don't have internet. They'll have feature phones and cell phones. The shanty towns are dangerous, mostly because of fire hazard. One of them we were visiting, we were told, see that wire there? Don't touch that wire. We're like, why? Oh, that's the electric wire. And you could see it strung out of the bottom of a lamppost. And somebody basically just tapped into the city street light and pulled it into the shanty town. They said, it used to be on the ground, but the kids were stepping on it and dying. So now they lifted it up and it's on the fence. And so people live in sort of dangerous conditions. But they are starting to get tech. So there is this infrastructure of like satellite TV, and internet could piggyback on this or come in other ways. There's a lot of demand for it. Yeah.
The Nigerians are immigrants. Nigerian immigrants.
In the shanty town?
Yeah.
Okay. I hadn't remembered that. If people didn't hear, my wife was reminding me that most of the people living in that shanty town are immigrants. We spend a lot of time too with people who are, might be called like tier 1 economic strata here. So people who live on less than $1 a day. Zimbabwe is a strange place because their economy is totally broken. Maybe you've heard about the hyperinflation that they had a number of years ago. They still have an official unemployment rate of 95%, which means that only 5% of people are paying taxes and tracked by the government. The other 95% have to be sort of supported through the black market. So many people don't have much. we did some technical work. We introduced some technology to this family in the form of a biodigester. So these are farmers, and one of the challenges they have is just cooking breakfast and boiling water. And so usually the daughter in the family will go out twice a week looking for wood. So she'll wake up at 4 a.m., she'll go look for wood for a couple hours, get back at 6, make a fire, cook breakfast for her brothers, and if she's not exhausted, she'll go to school. And the girls tend to drop out of school early because of all the extra work they have to do. They also drop out because there's no bathrooms at the schools. And so when they hit puberty, there's nowhere to take care of their bodies. And so once a month, they have to spend a week at home. And so their moms say, well, okay, now you're a woman, come home and work with me in the house. And so introducing this kind of technology at least helps with the first problem, where this is basically a big bag that the farmers fill with cow poop and water, and it starts to rot in the bag, and it off-gasses methane. And there's a garden hose that pulls it from the bag into the kitchen and a little gas burner. And so they can cook with methane gas in the kitchen instead of going and looking for wood. So it helps with the girls' quality of life. They don't have to look for wood all the time. Also helps with things like deforestation. It's hard to get this kind of tech into Zimbabwe right now because there's no infrastructure. But there's a nonprofit there that works on this sort of thing that we worked with. So not everybody in that area is at that economic level. We spent some time with Maasai warriors in East Kenya who are a little bit higher up, probably like level 2 or level 3 economic status. This guy has a smartphone tucked under his traditional tunic and a digital watch on. He's brushing his teeth with a stick from a toothbrush tree. It works. So we tried the toothbrush tree also. They all have excellent teeth. I think that, the interesting thing there is actually very few people have smartphones in that part of the world. Most people are on feature phones that just do they have like 12 buttons and like the old Nokia phones of 2005. And there's a lot of interesting services that are popping up around those phones. So one of the ones that was kind of one of the rare success stories of a South African entrepreneur was this fintech company, EcoCash. And so EcoCash was started by a Zimbabwean guy. It turns out we learned that most African entrepreneurs are unsuccessful because other Africans will not support them due to tribalism and jealousy. So it's like a really strange culture there. So this was like, this guy did it, it's like a really big deal. And EcoCash is basically a financial transaction system. If you've heard of M-Pesa, it's similar to that, where you can have a really cheap phone that just has GSM, and you can use GSM dial codes to send money securely to somebody else. And the way that it works is that anybody can be an endpoint where they do the conversion from electronic money into hard currency. And in exchange for doing that, all you need for that is a cell phone and to sign up on the network. And in exchange for doing the currency exchanges, you take a 1.5% commission. And then EcoCash also takes a 1.5% commission on the back end. So it's basically 3% to charge a fee to use a user to send money to somebody. And only the recipient pays it. So it's really 3% to receive the money. And this is everywhere and everybody uses it because most people don't have enough money to get a bank account. Most people can't get credit. And so they're using this system. In the past, people used airtime minutes. We talked to people in Kenya who still use airtime minutes a little bit as currency, but these sorts of, let's say, internet services are starting to supplant them. Is it really internet service? I don't know. It's like GSM network services is probably more like it. So let me step away from Africa for a little bit and tell you some stories from the Asia Pacific region. Yeah, so everywhere we went, I asked people the same question. What's your phone for? And they'd usually look at me quizzically like, what? It's like, do you have a phone? It's like, oh yeah. It's like, tell me about your phone. Tell me what you do with it. In India, when I asked a guy in Delhi, what's your phone for? He started telling me, he's like, oh, well, I like to send messages to my friends. And, oh, I have a business page there. People go to my business page and I get business that way. It's like, oh, where's your business page? Facebook. And he starts telling me about all these things that he's doing. Every one of them is Facebook, basically. I said, well, do you mostly use Facebook? He said, yeah, I use Facebook for a lot of stuff. Yeah, that's mostly what I need. And he's going on, and I said, well, do you use Google for anything? He said, oh, yeah, Uncle Google. I said, what's Uncle Google? He said, oh, and then we don't know the answer to a question we asked Uncle Google. Uncle Google. And I sort of dug deeper into that, and it turns out that, like, he would just always rather get the answer to the question from a person. And I said, well, do you use anything else? Oh, sometimes we go to YouTube. It's like, oh, really? He said, yeah, YouTube, we like it better because there's people there. So you're like, who's giving you the answer. Like, it's interesting. I said, Google Maps. He said, oh, yeah, good traffic data. It's like, interesting. OK. I think one of the problems with the Google services in a lot of the countries we went to is they just don't work. And in contrast, WhatsApp, SMS, and Instagram are super, super, super robust. And everyone I asked throughout all of the world outside of like what we'd call Western countries, all of the non-Western countries, when I asked them what they did with their phone, they would tell me the top 1 or 2 apps. And it was always 2 of these 3. It was always either WhatsApp and Instagram, or Instagram and WhatsApp, or Facebook and Instagram. But basically WhatsApp, SMS, Instagram, Facebook, that's what people use. And I talked to some people at Facebook about it, and they said, we used to have like an OKR for 2 years to connect everyone in the world. And it's like, oh, that makes sense, because you guys probably ascribe to Metcalfe's law, where the value of the network goes up with the square of the number of users. So you want to have all the users in the world. And I'd say, like, in contrast, most of the conversations I've had with product managers at Google go a different way. People say, well, pretty soon everybody in the world's going to have a smartphone, and when they do, our services will work for them. In fact, in 2011, when I had just joined Google from Nokia, I asked the product manager on the project at the time, it's like, hey, he had come from Latitude over at Android, and I said, hey, are we doing things for people on feature phones? And he said, no, in 2 years, everyone in the world will have a smartphone. And so, it's 7 years later. I'd say 56% of the world still doesn't have access to the internet, but only 25% of the world doesn't have access to a cell phone right now. So, my advice would be maybe Google could do a little better meeting people where they're at instead of just waiting for everybody to come to Google. But anyway, perhaps I digress. One of the things that we noticed was that in developing countries, people really aren't glued to their phones. The kind of like screen addiction that we fight with here, just didn't see it anywhere. The only place we saw it was in airports. And when I talked to people about their phones, like this guy, Marino, I said, oh, do you have a phone? He said, oh, yeah, I have 2. I said, oh, tell me about your phones. He said, well, I have a Nokia phone. It works up in the mountains because we have old networks, and it's the only thing that works. It's really reliable, works everywhere. And I have my WhatsApp phone. It's like, oh, tell me about your WhatsApp phone. What do you do with that? WhatsApp. And I was like, well, do you do anything else? He said, oh, yeah, I also do some Instagram. It's like, oh, what's it for? He said, well, the WhatsApp is mostly for business, like to talk to people like you when I need to connect with people. And then Instagram is for sending pictures to my family and my friends. One of the interesting notable exceptions to many of the countries we traveled was Cambodia. So Cambodia is a really poor country. People live on less than $1 a day on average. But somehow they have really affordable infrastructure there. So you can get a streaming 4G plan in Cambodia for $1 a month. And I don't know how they do it, but they're doing it. And so lots of interesting things are popping up. We were having lunch on a rice farm, kind of learning how to cook some traditional food. I was a little sick that day, but somebody came up to me after lunch and said, hey, Hayes, you should go ask the guy in that stilt house about his computer. But has a computer? That's interesting. And so I went to talk to this guy, and yeah, he has a computer. He's pretty proud. This guy's 20 years old, and he got a cheap computer from Singapore that he uses mostly for video editing and for playing music for his family. So you can see the speakers there. It's kind of their entertainment system. And then he was able to save up some money for a halfway decent cell phone that has a good camera on it. And he was very proud when he told me it was a Korean phone. Not a Samsung, but some sort of cheap Korean phone, because everybody there has Chinese phones, which are cheap and the quality's low. And so he said, I'm a musician and I like to play traditional music, so I have a YouTube channel. And it's like, oh, you have a YouTube channel. That's kind of amazing. So he showed me his YouTube channel, and like, he's asking me questions. It's like, hey, this computer, I'd like to edit videos, but this is all through Translator, by the way. I can't edit videos. And so we talked for a while. It was interesting to hear, this guy's got like enough disposable income to be spending money on tech for his hobbies, using it for the kinds of things that we imagine, people all over the world might use it for. And he's young, and he's living in a stilt house on a rice farm. So it's like, that's kind of cool. Haven't seen much of that yet. Another great example, this was Christmas Eve. We were in Siem Reap, which is a reasonably sized city. We were tired. We needed to get back to our hotel. The kids were sad because nobody celebrates Christmas in Cambodia. And I bump into this happy guy who jumps out of his tuk-tuk. And I say, hey, can you give us a ride? He said, I have a karaoke tuk-tuk. I can give you a ride. I said, what do you mean you have a karaoke tuk-tuk? What kind of music do you have? I have YouTube. Anything you want. And he pulls a tablet off of his handlebar, and he hands it to me. And I was like, oh my God, Santa just came. And so he sets us up in the back seat, and he's got a couple mics wired up to it. He's got lights wired up. He's got a 4G streaming data plan and an Android tablet running YouTube. And we had so much fun that we made as soon as we got to the hotel, we told them to turn around and do another lap. And so this guy is basically charging like a 50% premium on a normal tuk-tuk ride. So for us, it went from like $4 to $6. And able to do it profitably because they have pretty cheap infrastructure that works. And all the parts, he's scrappy and able to put it together himself. One other thing we saw that surprised me is that we were at an after-school center out in a really rural area with rice farmers that had been funded mostly by foreign donations. And they have a computer lab. And I went to talk to the guy who leads the lab there and said, hey, what do you teach the kids? And he said, well, I teach them Excel and PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. And I said, oh, do you have the internet? He said, oh yeah, we have a great connection here. Very proud. I said, well, why don't you teach them anything online? He said, well, because I'm just trying to teach them computers and I don't have enough time to teach them how to use the web. And I said, in my house, I gave the kids the web before I gave them the rest of the computer stuff. Do you know there's a lot of free content on the web? And he said, free? And I said, yeah, free. Free? Yeah, free. Like, it's really free. And so I showed him that stuff. He had no idea it was there. But his challenge was, he said he's trying to get 400 kids through his lab every 6 months. So he's got a capacity problem. He's only got a few hours with each kid. And what he's trying to teach them is basic skills they need so that if they go to the city and want to get a job, they can sit down at a computer and pick it up and do something useful. And so, definitely he could do more if he knew more. But he's taking a very practical approach right now. Not everything in Cambodia was starting to look like it would be similar to here. They claim to be a communist country. It's not really a communist country. It's more of a totalitarian regime that's run by the former Khmer Rouge. So their prime minister is openly former Khmer Rouge. About 10% of their police force is secretly former Khmer Rouge. People are afraid of the government. And numerous people explain to us that if you speak up against the government, you'll disappear. We heard this in Vietnam also. And one person said, the only person I know who has spoken up against the government is a friend who could afford to go to South Korea and open a Facebook account under a pseudonym there and talk about some of the horrible things that happen here from South Korea, because you just can't do that here. And I think that one of the things I remember people talking about in the early days of the internet is that it would democratize and open up free speech. And I'd say that, we just didn't see that. What we saw was that governments were very adept at controlling dissemination of information and speech through fear. And we saw this repeatedly. Okay, what else? So Hong Kong, can you count all the cell phones there? This is our taxi driver going from the airport to a friend's house. And he had a whole lot of cheap Android phones. And so let's see, here's what's going on. This is a walkie-talkie chat room, like a shared app with a bunch of other taxi drivers. And he's got it wired up to an earphone that goes up his door and around, and like a little earbud drops down and he plugs it in his ear while he's driving. It's got a microphone. And so it's push to talk. It's red because he's touching and he's talking to the group. and it's all asynchronous, so it can work on a flaky network. And then each one of these phones is a different ride-sharing app. So he's got 5 different phones there for 5 different ride-share apps. What we call in the user interface world a flat UI. And then he's got his normal like taxi computers for the normal dispatch. And so there's a lot of ride sharing there. It's very fragmented. So they're dealing with fragmented software by just having fragmented hardware. And it works. And yeah, I think when the cell phones are super cheap, you can start to do more and more of that. So it's maybe an interesting prediction of what cars might look like in the future. And then we also saw some of the opposite. So in New Zealand, infrastructure works beautifully. Google services work beautifully. People use them a little bit. And in talking to people like, why don't you use them more? Somebody said to me, well, people say about New Zealand, we kind of lived 20 years in the past. And we do. We kind of like it that way. And so there were definitely situations where there just wasn't the same cultural interest in making technology really central in people's lives. So just to kind of sum up, I'll talk about some of the global trends I saw. One is that everyone learns similar basics. In school, the curriculum's all based on International Baccalaureate everywhere we went. Quality of teaching is not uniform, but the curriculum is. And technology is universal. Even here's a cave dweller in central Turkey who has a satellite TV in their cave. People are totally and completely obsessed with people. And phones are first and foremost about people, which is, I think, the other reason why Facebook is doing really well. No one mentioned Google. Not a single person all year long when I asked them what they do with their phone. E-learning is basically office skills. And internet prices vary really widely. Can counter that $1 a month in Cambodia with $30 a month for the same service in Kenya, with a roughly similar standard of living. Mobile infrastructure changes really slowly, so a lot of old Nokia networks and a lot of Nokia phones on them. Most villagers can't afford cell data. And phones are, once you got the people part covered, the next thing they're for is business. Nobody knew about Android, and the Google makes that. And I think one of the opportunities I saw is nobody seems to be making the Honda of cell phones. And so what do I mean by this? Honda came into the US market in 1972 with a solid, practical design that just works, that was going to last longer than 3 years. And right now, in my view, the phone market is a little bit like the US car market of 1950. Everything's designed just to work for a couple of years. So I wonder, who's going to come in with that solid, practical design that just works? It's going to work for like 5 years or more. Google could do this. I think we should. And then, different kinds of infrastructure matters. The general ranked order that I saw mattering to people is the first thing people worry about is shelter and clothing. The second thing people worry about is food. If you have food, you're okay. Once you have food, it's good to make sure you have water. A lot of people have water, but not clean water. Countries that have food by default have water also, because you need water to make food. When we talk to people, especially farmers, about why they needed to make money, mostly it was for medicine. So that was the top of the list for people. Once your own body's okay, you care about your family, your tribe, your community. And after that, people really care about jobs. If you look at why people revolt, usually they revolt because there aren't enough jobs. Electricity is, I'd say, in terms of technical infrastructure, the most important thing. When we were in Spain, in a quite developed city, when the power went out, it was pretty indistinguishable from this Indonesian village in terms of what we could do. Just none of the modern amenities worked. No electric lights, no dishwasher, no washing machine, no phones. All that stuff's gone. Once you have electricity, you're probably going to use it for entertainment. Might be a light bulb for telling stories, or a TV for watching stories, or YouTube. And then people might look at education after that. And information, as we think about it at Google, is kind of really low on people's lists. It's usually not something that people seem to have a lot of value for. So that's it. Thank you. I have about 10 minutes for questions.